The image of an emergency raft, barely afloat on the grey, unforgiving waters of the English Channel, its occupants huddled and often desperate, has become an indelible and profoundly disturbing emblem of Britain's contemporary condition. It is a spectacle that almost daily plays out on our screens, in our newspapers, and increasingly in the minds of a bewildered public who are left to ask, how did we arrive at this point? Why, despite repeated political pronouncements, public outcries, and the sheer unarguable logic of national sovereignty, does the crisis at our borders not merely persist, but deepen with an alarming, almost willful regularity? This is not merely a question of logistics or a momentary surge in migrant numbers. It is a fundamental challenge to the very idea of the nation-state, to the integrity of its laws, and to the contract between the governed and those who govern. What truly happens when the institutions ostensibly established to protect a nation's boundaries become, through a complex interplay of ideological capture, bureaucratic inertia, and a peculiar form of societal self-abnegation, incapable or unwilling to perform their most basic duty? The observable reality is stark enough. Thousands arriving on our shores via dangerous, illegal routes, facilitated by ruthless criminal networks. These are not merely statistics, they are individuals presenting themselves at a frontier that, by all traditional measures, should be inviolable. Yet, the official response often seems to be one of perpetual motion without meaningful progress. A government announces a new policy, a fresh deterrent, or another agreement with a continental neighbour, only for the numbers to continue their upward trajectory, accompanied by a chorus of legal challenges and a seemingly bottomless well of institutional excuses. We are told of the complexities of international law, the obligations of human rights treaties, the compassion inherent in a liberal democracy, but beneath this veneer of well-meaning intent lies a more troubling, multi-layered reality. The first layer of this reality concerns political and institutional motivation. Why the paralysis? One might imagine that any government, regardless of its ideological stripe, would find the uncontrolled entry of thousands of unvetted individuals into its territory a matter of utmost urgency, demanding immediate and decisive action. Yet, what we observe is a constant, almost ritualistic performance of concern that rarely translates into effective control. The motivation, it seems, is not solely about competence, but about avoiding the perceived political cost of genuine enforcement. To truly stop the boats, one must be willing to engage in actions that are deemed unpalatable by a powerful, albeit unelected, constellation of legal activists, charities, and media commentators. The political elite operating within this highly charged environment are often more concerned with the optics of being seen to be compassionate or lawful in a narrowly defined sense than with the foundational responsibility of securing the realm. They are caught in a self-imposed bind where the perceived short-term damage of being labelled inhumane outweighs the long-term, systemic damage of losing control of the borders. This leads us to the ideological constraints that suffocate any genuine attempt at resolution. Britain, like much of Western Europe, has for decades been operating under a post-national consensus that views robust border control, particularly against those claiming asylum, as morally suspect, if not outright reprehensible. This ideology, rooted in a radical interpretation of universal human rights and a profound discomfort with the very concept of national sovereignty, has deeply permeated our legal system, our civil service, and even aspects of our security apparatus. It champions a vision of humanity without borders, where the individual's right to seek refuge trumps the collective right of a nation to determine its own membership and enforce its own laws. This is not to say that genuine asylum seekers do not exist, but rather that the framework has become so expansive, so abstract, that it has been weaponized by those who exploit it and those who, perhaps naively, believe in its universal applicability without accounting for its practical consequences. We have created a system where a claimant's mere presence on our soil, irrespective of the legality of their arrival, immediately triggers a cascade of expensive, lengthy, and often futile legal processes that are almost universally stacked against the state's ability to deport. The strategic consequences of this ideological capture are devastatingly clear. The public's trust in government, already fragile, erodes further with each unfulfilled promise and each daily image of yet another boat landing unchallenged. The financial burden on the taxpayer is enormous, not just for processing and housing claimants, but for the entire infrastructure of a broken system. Social cohesion strains under the pressure of unplanned demographic shifts and the perception of a two-tiered system of justice, one for citizens and another for those who arrive outside the law. And, perhaps most insidiously, a culture of impunity begins to take root, where the rule of law is perceived as an inconvenience rather than a sacrosanct principle. This is the intellectual revelation that challenges mainstream assumptions. The current crisis is not a failure of resources, but a failure of will, driven by a powerful internal ideological opposition to the very concept of national self-preservation. We are witnessing not merely a policy challenge, but a profound cultural and political surrender. To fully grasp the depth of this surrender, we must cast our gaze backward, examining the historical and cultural context that has shaped our current predicament. The post-war era, born from the ashes of two devastating global conflicts, brought with it a laudable commitment to human rights and international cooperation. But somewhere along the line, the spirit of these conventions, designed to prevent genocide and protect truly persecuted individuals, was reinterpreted, expanded, and weaponized far beyond its original intent. The European Convention on Human Rights, for instance, once a bulwark against state tyranny, has become a primary tool used to frustrate the sovereign decisions of its signatory states on matters as fundamental as border control. This expansion, often driven by activist judges and a legal profession with a vested interest in its ever-growing complexity, has created a de facto legal supremacy that undermines parliamentary democracy. Consider the historical parallels. The decline of great empires, from Rome to the British Empire itself, often coincided with a loss of internal cohesion, a weakening of resolve, and an inability to define or defend their own borders. While the specific circumstances differ, the underlying pattern of a ruling elite becoming detached from the foundational concerns of its populace, often couched in high-minded universalist rhetoric, remains strikingly familiar. After the Second World War, Britain embarked on an ambitious project of decolonization, embracing a globalist outlook. Yet, in the ensuing decades, it seems to have forgotten the very lessons of sovereignty it once championed for newly independent nations. The shift from an imperial power meticulously controlling its vast territories to a nation seemingly incapable of controlling a mere 20-mile stretch of water is a historical irony of immense proportions. It suggests a deep-seated cultural shift, where the concept of national identity itself has been progressively eroded, replaced by a fluid, universalist ideal that, while appealing in theory, proves deeply destabilizing in practice. The Enlightenment, which gifted us the ideals of individual liberty and human dignity, also emphasized reason, order, and the social contract necessary for a functioning society. What we are witnessing today is not an affirmation of these ideals, but a perversion of them, where individual claims are elevated to an absolute status that negates collective responsibility and the very notion of a bounded community. This is further compounded by the rise of postmodern ideologies that question all grand narratives, including that of national identity and historical continuity. If all identities are fluid, if all borders are artificial constructs, then what moral or philosophical ground does the state have to assert its authority? Who, in such an intellectual climate, is truly empowered to say no? This cultural diffidence has manifested in a political class that appears unable or perhaps psychologically unwilling to confront the implications of mass migration without control. They are trapped between the demands of a vocal progressive establishment, which often frames any attempt at control as xenophobic or racist, and the increasingly desperate pleas of a public that simply wants a secure homeland. The unstated incentive for many politicians is simply to defer the problem, to pass it on to the next administration, or to rely on the hope that some external event will magically resolve what is in fact a deep internal failing. This intellectual reveal is crucial. The border crisis is not merely a symptom of external pressures, but a profound reflection of an internal crisis of confidence and identity within Britain itself. It reflects a society that has, in many ways, lost faith in its own foundational values and its right to self-preservation. The long-term global and civilizational implications are profound. If a nation like Britain, with its long history of stable governance, robust legal traditions, and undeniable economic strength, proves incapable of securing its own borders, what message does this send to other, less stable nations? What precedent does it set for the future of the nation-state in a world facing unprecedented migratory pressures? We are witnessing a slow but relentless normalization of the abnormal, where what was once unthinkable, the routine, illegal breaching of national sovereignty, becomes an accepted, even expected feature of daily life. This is not merely an issue for Britain, it is a test case for the entire Western model of governance. The challenge to the very notion of territorial integrity extends far beyond the English Channel. It speaks to a broader phenomenon across the West, where the concept of citizenship itself is being hollowed out, losing its exclusive meaning and responsibilities. When the benefits of a society are extended indiscriminately, regardless of contribution or adherence to law, what incentive remains for civic participation or loyalty? What happens when the foundational premise of a nation, that its citizens, through their collective consent, define its boundaries and its character, is continuously undermined by a combination of external pressure and internal ideological paralysis? We are observing a quiet revolution, not of popular uprising, but of institutional atrophy, where the organs of state progressively surrender their function. The narrative crafted around this crisis, echoed by many within the institutional sphere, often dismisses public concerns as mere xenophobia or a lack of compassion. It frames the debate in moral absolutist terms, where any pushback against uncontrolled migration is branded as morally reprehensible. Yet, this narrative carefully avoids the strategic question: what are the limits of this compassion? What happens to a society when its foundational values, rule of law, national cohesion, democratic self-determination, are sacrificed on the altar of an abstract, boundless universalism? What are the consequences when the very institutions built to protect us become the primary source of instability, not through malice, but through a misguided adherence to an ideology that ultimately undermines the nation itself? The future trajectory, if these trends persist, is not merely one of continued arrivals, but of a more fundamental societal fragmentation. The concept of the social contract implicitly relies on shared values, shared responsibility, and a shared understanding of who we are. When this is diluted, when the state effectively signals that its borders are porous and its laws negotiable, the glue that binds a society together begins to dissolve. This erosion of national identity, coupled with an increasing reliance on a legal framework that prioritizes individual claims above collective national interests, points towards a future where the traditional nation-state might exist only in name, a geographical expression, rather than a cohesive political entity. So, as we observe the persistent, seemingly intractable crisis at Britain's borders, we are compelled to look beyond the immediate headlines, beyond the daily political theatre, and deeper into the ideological currents and institutional pathologies that animate it. This is not simply about immigration figures. It is about the future of a sovereign nation, its capacity for self-governance, and indeed, its very identity. What happens when a civilization, through a combination of internal ideological capture and a peculiar self-doubt, effectively chooses to dismantle the very mechanisms designed for its own preservation, and who, ultimately, benefits from such a profound abdication of institutional responsibility?